Is the behavior panel doing more harm than good? This is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. In today's episode, I'm going to be taking a critical look at what I consider to be the shady behaviors of the behavioral panel. I'm going to be looking at their claims of being able to detect deception by studying body language, microexpression, and by doing statement analysis. Now, to be honest with you, I'm disgusted by the behaviors of the behavioral panel, and I'll tell you why. I'm going to use one specific case to illustrate this. This is the case that really prompted me to make this video, and that is the Amanda Knox case. So, Amanda Knox, in case you didn't know, is a woman who was innocently convicted of murdering her housemate, Meredith Kircher, and who served 4 years in prison in Italy in what was a horrible miscarriage of justice before she was eventually exonerated by the Italian High Court. Now, everyone, there was never any evidence tying Amanda Knox to this case, to this crime whatsoever. Now, of course, everyone is entitled to their opinion. If someone wants to believe that Amanda Knox is really guilty of these crimes, they have every right to think that and to spout that. What really irks me about this is that when the four gentlemen of the behavior panel, Chase Hughes, Mark Bowden, Scott Rouse, and Greg Hartley, when they did their two-part series on the Amanda Knox case, they have a YouTube channel that has over 800,000 subscribers. More than 440,000 people have watched the videos. And here they are taking an innocent person who has suffered a horrible miscarriage of justice, and they are more than implying that she's being very deceptive and concluding that she has guilty knowledge. So in all likelihood, based upon this two-part video series that they did, tens of thousands of people probably sit with the perception that Amanda Knox is really guilty after all, based upon the claims of the behavior panel that they can see that she's deceptive based upon her microexpressions, her body language, and the way she uses language. And what really bugs me about this is that the four gentlemen in the behavior panel claim that there's a strong scientific basis behind their claims. So they kind of sit there with the authority of science, so to speak, and attempt to persuade people. So we're going to have a look at the science to take a look at what scientific basis is there really for their claims to begin with. Now, Scott Rouse says that he's a body language expert and that he trains law enforcement. Greg Hartley says that he has a background in the military and that he is an instructor of interrogation and resistance to interrogation, and that he teaches body language. Mark Bowden claims to be an expert on body language, and Chase Hughes has a 20-year military career, and I think he studied neuroscience as well. I might be wrong about that or not, but anyways, between them, they work on Wall Street. They sell products. They are trial consultants. They are developing courses for law enforcement and interrogators and military personnel. So they're having quite a bit of influence. Now, according to Rouse, Hartley, Hughes, and Bowden, they are themselves four of the leading experts in the world on body language. And that's kind of the first thing to ask is like, who, you know, who reached that conclusion? Um, by what criteria? What accomplishments do these guys really have in actually being able to detect deception? Granted, they've written books, they're selling courses, they're being used as trial consultants, but where is the evidence that these four people have a higher, so the kind of average of being able to detect falsehoods is about 54%. So is there any evidence whatsoever that these guys are any better than that? And just because you've written books or been able to sell courses to 500 companies or being used as a trial consultant does not in of itself tell anything about what actual skills these folks have and what they're doing. Of course, Dr. Phil endorsed them, as among the world leading experts on body language. But where is any test to show that Dr. Phil has much skill regarding this? Dr. Phil, by the way, the very same guy who has for a number of years duped his audience and millions of TV viewers by bringing polygraph experts into his show and having guests on his show be determined to have told the truth or lied based upon how their polygraph comes out. Now, the irony is, this is kind of deceptive because there really is no scientific basis whatsoever that the polygraph actually detects deception. You can't even use it in a court of law. You know, even Dr. Phil knows this, but he's more than happy to dupe millions of TV viewers and his audience with the false notion that he himself knows to be false, that the polygraph actually detects deception, when in reality it does no such thing. So, I mean, if a guy like Dr. Phil endorses you, you know, well, what can I say? What kind of ethical compass is that? So, what these guys in the behavior panel usually do is that they look at well-known cases, right? So, like the Ted Bundy case, who everyone knows who's guilty. And they kind of retrospectively look back and they cherry pick these behavioral cues and linguistic statements and they go, oh, we see deception here and we see deception here and so on and so forth. But my first point is I'd really like to see these guys tested. I'd actually like to see these guys tested in cases where we don't actually know if someone has committed a crime or not. Now, in the Amanda Knox case, we actually do know the actual killer's name is Rudy Guidi. His DNA was found all over the place. There's no doubt whatsoever that he's the actual killer, and there's nothing whatsoever tying Amanda Knox to the case except for her own false confession, which Greg Hartley is more than happy to endorse or not even mention, right? Um, so even in this case, they managed to see deception all over the place. So as let me find my quick note here. So I mean, even and who, by the way, who does this to a person who has served 4 years for a murder she didn't commit in an Italian prison? I mean, who slanders someone like this? So even in the title of the first video, is she really innocent, right? And I'll go through some of this stuff, but so Scott Rouse says, We don't say whether anyone is guilty or not. We just say we see deception here and we see truth here, and we're just sharing that with you. And I would argue that they're not actually seeing deception or truth. They are seeing behaviors and they are making inferences. They are making inferences that so-called microexpressions and body language gives you a window into the person's mind where you can actually detect whether a person is truthful or not. It gets even worse. Uh, at one particular moment in the video, they ask each other, what level of truth do you think we see here? And they come up with numbers like 20% and 25%. And and Chase Hughes and Greg Hartley conclude that, guilty or not, she has guilty knowledge. Here's the irony in all of this. It's actually Chase Hughes and Greg Hartley who have guilty knowledge. They have guilty knowledge in the way that they actually know that the scientific basis for their claims is extremely weak, and they are more than happy to pretend the opposite in their videos. And something else that's kind of ironic by all of this is that the main reason why Amanda Knox got convicted to begin with was by people, uh, Italian police investigators, sharing the exact same mindset that if someone doesn't quite behave the way you expect them to behave, and you have a particular hunch, and you can spot based upon their body language that they're deceptive, it's exactly that sort of mindset that created that mess to begin with. And instead of acknowledging that, they actually keep reinforcing the exact same notions. So let's have a little look at the science. So let's have a look at body language and micro expressions. By the way, when it comes to body language, there is very little solid evidence that analyzing body language is at all useful in detecting deception. I highly recommend checking out the book Duped by the detection researcher Timothy Levine, who has a unified theory of deception, who's gone through all the literature, all the studies, all the meta studies, and the conclusions are quite clear. There really is very little weak support, if anything, to support the idea that you can accurately detect deception by studying body language. And in the United States, the federal government's TSA, Transportation and Security Administration, has spent close to $1 billion on a so-called SPOT program, where agents are asking people in airports, questions, and trying to use cues from body language and micro expressions to discern whether they are dealing with someone who's deceptive or is a terrorist. So close to $1 billion over the years. Now here's the science, and I'm quoting here from Mark Godsey's book, Blind Injustice. So let's see here. The federal government's Transportation Security Administration has spent nearly $1 billion in recent years training its agents at airports to detect passengers who are allegedly lying during screening interviews and thus are potential terrorism threats, using the same indicators of dishonesty: fidgety behavior, minimal eye contact, and so on, and micro expressions. He doesn't mention that, but that's also part of the package. that we now know are not accurate indicators. The United States Government Accountability Office issued a scathing report to Congress on this practice in 2013, stating available evidence does not support whether behavioral indicators, which are used in the Transportation Security Administration's TSA screening of passengers by observation techniques, that's the SPOT program, can be used to identify persons who may pose a risk to aviation security. GAO reviewed 4 meta-analyses, that's reviews that analyze other studies and synthesize their findings, that included over 400 studies from the past 60 years and found that the human ability to accurately identify deceptive behavior based on behavioral indicators is the same as or slightly better than chance. Consider that. I ask you, if you watch the behavior panel, keep that in mind. That is the scientific basis for their claims. I have a little bit more here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading to you, but this is from Nicholas Epley's book, Mindwise. The SPOT program, the one I just mentioned, has been widely criticized as being built upon a weak scientific foundation. It says here, between 2004 and 2008, roughly 152,000 people were detained for additional questioning. This is based upon body language and microexpressions and linguistic or statement analysis. Of those, 14,000 were detained further to be interrogated by law enforcement officers, eventually resulting in 1,083 arrests. This means that less than 1% of those identified by SPOT officers were actually arrested for a criminal offense. And 99% were needlessly detained, ignoring the 151,000 people who were needlessly detained. Were those arrested actually concealing guns, drugs, bombs, or terrorist information as the program was originally designed to catch? Almost never. And not a single terrorist. So that's kind of funny. Not a single terrorist has been caught using this program, right? So let's have a look at Ekman's research, because so much of the body language industry is based upon Ekman's work into deception, nonverbal behavior, and microexpressions. So Ekman, just to give you a little bit of history here, Ekman, inspired by Charles Darwin, believed that emotions were universal, shared with other animals, and that there were specific facial expressions distinct for various emotions. So distinct emotional expressions for anger, fear, sadness, contentment or happiness, surprise, disgust, and contempt. So Ekman claimed to identify 7 universal emotions that had universal facial expressions connected with them, just like Darwin claimed back in the day. And there was a conflict between the claims of Charles Darwin and Margaret Mead, who was an anthropologist who claimed that emotions were and their expressions were culturally, conditioned. So Ekman set out to solve this, right? And what he did is he was able to get his hands on some footage from a tribe in Papua New Guinea. And this was called the Four People. And they had, up until extremely recently, lived the same way that they did in the Stone Age. So Paul Ekman and another psychologist called Wally Friesen and an anthropologist whose name escapes me at the moment, who knew a little bit of that language, just a tiny little bit, who worked, functioned as a translator, went to Papua New Guinea and spent time with the four people. And what Ekman would do, and this was very difficult due to the language barriers, was that he had he hadn't conceptualized contempt yet as a universal emotion, but he had pictures of American models showing facial expressions of happiness, fear, sadness, anger, um, surprise, and disgust. You know, six emotions, right? And what he would do is he would tell stories, or offer kind of scenarios to these people. And he would also ask them, which of these is the anger, picture, or, which is the sadness one. And they scored really high on the happiness picture. The other ones were a bit more shaky, but enough that Ekman concluded. He's had 2 trips to Papua New Guinea and spent time with 2 different tribes. So good enough that Ekman concluded that, wait a minute, we have the same universal expressions for these 6 emotions uh, among the 4 people in Papua New Guinea as we have with North Americans. He also went to Chile, Argentina, Brazil, I think, and Japan, and kind of confirmed the same thing. And this was gospel in psychology for many years. The idea that emotions are innate, that they're universal, that there are universal facial expressions for some of them, and that they are kind of triggered, and that we share them with other animals. By the way, today in psychology, you'd be surprised to know that there isn't really even consensus regarding the basic question, what is an emotion? I made a video a while back called Paul Ekman versus Lisa Feldman Barrett that I recommend you watch if you're interested in this topic, where I talk a little bit about what I have found useful and not in terms of working with clients from each of their frameworks. But scientifically today, there really is no support for the idea of universal emotions or universal facial expressions for certain emotions, or that we have particular emotion circuits in the brain, or that different emotions have distinct physiologies. The science does actually not support any of those claims at all. So Ekman has a lot of studies, but time has not fared well with Ekman's claims, meaning it's been very difficult for other people to verify his claims. So the first big challenge to Ekman's claims was the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett. And Lisa Feldman Barrett kind of set out to kind of replicate Ekman's work. But what she discovered was that when she no longer used the kind of forced choice of here are 6 different emotion pictures, which one is the sadness one? When she no longer did that, even with North Americans, when she just had an open question of, what does this person experience, then the correlations plummeted, right? And then members of her team went to study, let me just find here. Members of her team went to study in what was called the Hadza people in Tanzania. And he also had, let me see if I can only find, because I know that I have it here. Dun, 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 dun. Yeah, Maria Gendron, who was a Lisa Feldman Barrett student, traveled to the mountains of northwest Namibia and spent time with a tribe there, and the findings did not replicate, right? And then in 2018, but of course, Lisa Feldman Barrett kind of has a competing theory, that's called constructed emotions. But in 2018, Lisa Feldman Barrett and four other colleagues published a meta study where they spent and these four other colleagues had very different theoretical frameworks when it came to emotion. They spent 2.5 years going through more than 1,000 research papers over the span of 25 years, looking at facial expressions in relation to emotion. And based upon those 2.5 years of work, they landed on the conclusion, it was a big meta study, that there is no universal facial expressions for any emotion. So nothing, right? So that's kind of a little punch into Ekman's claims. There's some other interesting ones here as well. There's two German psychologists, and I'll butcher these names. They're called Schutzwohl and Reisensein, who took 60 participants and had them walk through a corridor and into a room where they listened to a Kafka recording and then were subjected to a memory test. And then once they left the room, people had been very busy at work rearranging that whole hallway so that it looked completely different. Like the hallway was gone. It was just this big room. And in a chair, one of their best friends was looking at them sitting in a chair, right? So this evoked a response of surprise in almost everyone. Almost all 60 people claimed to be feeling surprised as a result of this. But and everyone was convinced that the feelings of surprise were written all over their faces. But only 5% showed the full facial expression that Ekman claims is connected with surprise. About 17% showed two of the three signs that you get with surprise. So that was kind of surprising as a study. Let's see what else we have here. We have some other really interesting things. We had a 2014 study at the University of Glasgow using advanced computer modeling of expressions that reported that feelings of anger and disgust, and also fear and surprise, shared features in common and should be merged into one core experience. So these researchers kind of concluded that instead of 6 basic emotions, then that we basically had 4. There's another really interesting psychologist by the name of Carlos Crivelli, and he had a partner as well whose name was Sergio Girillo, who was an anthropologist. And what Crivelli did is he actually watched videos of judo players, who reported happiness after winning their matches, and looked for, like, would they show the Ekman de Chen smile, and when would they show it? And he also watched videos of people masturbating and having orgasms. I mean, what people do and are willing to watch in the name of science, huh? And was also looking for facial expressions of joy and happiness, and found that his studies, his actual results didn't seem to match what Ekman would have predicted. So he and his anthropologist colleague went to the Trobriand's Islands, which is east of Papua New Guinea, where you have some people living there, and essentially tried to replicate Ekman's work. And before they did that, they went to Madrid and they would show people images of, happy faces and sad faces and angry faces. And when they did so in Madrid, they got very high match for happiness. They got relatively good matches for the other emotions as well. But when they went to the Trobriand's Islands, the whole thing collapsed. The strongest one was 58% identified the happiness picture as happiness. 23% called it neutral. The fear face that we consider to be the fear face, they interpreted as kind of anger or a threat face. And when they showed the anger picture, only 20% called it a happy face, 17% called it a sad face, 30% called it a fearful face, right? So there is a lot of stuff there to kind of suggest that the science behind all of this is kind of weak. There was a study in 2008 which looked at video footage of faces, emotional situations, where they discovered that in only 14 of the video fragments there were microexpressions. So that's like 2% of the total videos, and 6 of the 14 microexpressions were from truth tellers. There was an interesting 2019 study done by Saul Kassin and a bunch of other people. Now, Kassin, by the way, is the author of an excellent book called Duped, which is about false confessions, which I highly recommend that you read. And in this particular experiment, they discovered that observers who were trained in Ekman's system, when it came to high stakes lies, actually did worse than a control group and scored slightly lower than chance. So here you have a lot of the science, that they claim to be basing this on. Back to the behavior panel, right? So I want to just address a couple of things that they said. So Scott Rouse, for example, he talks about how Amanda Knox is doing a campaign of confusion. Now, Amanda Knox comes across as kind of awkward and mismatched, in a sense. And she does at times seem a bit confused. But I think that Rouse is engaging in emotional logic in the sense that, okay, the fact that he feels a bit confused and that Amanda Knox seems confused, he's kind of attributing that means that she's on a campaign to kind of be confusing, right? That she's trying to confuse the viewer. And I don't think you can claim that at all, using your own emotions and the other person's behavior as the source. There's a lot of nitpicking of language here. So for example, Chase Hughes makes the point that when she tells her story, she kind of tells it in a way where she is anticipating the typical objections that she's going to get and kind of baking that into her story when she describes what happened on that particular night. And my objection to his objection would be, well, why wouldn't she? I mean, if you spent 4 years in prison for a crime that you haven't committed, and you've suffered greatly from that, and you've had the experience that you're often not believed. Why would you not do that when you are asked on TV or as part of documentaries to tell what happened? So that's my objection to his objection. And I think there's a lot of cherry picking going on when Chase Hughes looks at Amanda Knox's language. So for example, Amanda Knox makes the comment that she had called Meredith Kircher's phone, or called Meredith Kircher, and her phone didn't answer. And of course, Chase Hughes is on that one and kind of goes, well, isn't that interesting? You know, how she says that the phone didn't answer, and that kind of implies that she kind of knew that, of course, Meredith couldn't answer, because Meredith was dead. Now, the reason why I'm saying that he's cherry picking is that a little bit later she talks about this other housemate called Laura, and she talks about calling Laura, and that her phone didn't answer either, right? So when it comes to Laura, who was not killed, uh, Amanda Knox is using the exact same language. It would have been one thing perhaps if it had been the case and he had noticed that, wait a minute, he's saying that her phone didn't answer in the case of Meredith Kircher, and saying that, Laura didn't pick up the phone. What might that be about? But that's not what happened. What happened is that both when it came to Meredith and Laura, she's used the same language. The phone didn't answer. And Chase Hughes cherry picks and creates all sorts of implications about it in the case of Meredith, but does not mention that she uses the exact same language when it comes to Laura's phone allegedly not answering. There's a lot of stuff here on for example, James Penbaker's research and how there seems to be some correlation between using distancing language and deception. But of course, the problem with this is that the correlations are extremely weak. And you see this with all sorts of studies that, when you focus on particular cues, some studies will say that this particular cue seems to be a bit more involved with deception. But then there's a bunch of other studies, right, that say that there's no correlation whatsoever. So, and I see this a lot in my office. There's a lot of people who talk about things when they're not deceptive, who use distancing language. It's one of those things where, yeah, you can notice it. You can kind of track it, but it is not at all a reliable indicator of deception. Let's see here. There's a couple of other things here. Greg Hartley, the interrogation guy. He talks about there being so many red flags, and that he as an interrogator would have been on that, and he kind of talks about how there was no wonder why the Italian interrogators went after her so hard because of all these alleged red flags, right? And when I listen to Greg Hartley, I know that the Reid technique is the prominent method for interrogation in the United States. And the Reid technique has just been a scandal. It was developed by John E. Reid in the 50s, and Reid was a psychologist and a police officer. And kind of interestingly, he was able, after a 12-hour interrogation where he was manipulating and lying and gaslighting and coercing, a man to confess to the murder of his wife, and he was sent to jail. And then more than a decade later, the actual killer confessed, and he was exonerated 13 years later. Now the Reid technique is a 9-step procedure, which is about getting interrogation, no, getting confessions. You know, first they kind of have a little interview, and if they spot red flags based upon body language and behavior, they go into the interrogation phase. And in the interrogation phase, it's all about getting a confession. It's all about lying, manipulating, gaslighting, and mentally exhausting the confessed person into confessing. Now, advocates of the Reid technique have claimed that by training in it, police officers can have like an 85% detection rate in detecting deception. This is complete bullshit. There's nothing to support this whatsoever. As a matter of fact, in all sorts of research on the ability to detect deception, police officers do not score any better than average Joe, So this is, of course, a lie from the Reid advocates. And it's an extremely dangerous method because it has a history of leading to a lot of false confessions. So in this particular case, Amanda Knox was unlucky to come home and discover Meredith Kircher's body, after the murder, obviously, but before anyone else discovered it, so the police could put her on the scene. And she didn't really show much emotion at all. She suppressed her emotions, and she's kind of socially awkward and weird. And Amanda Knox, the reason why the interrogators and the police went after her was not because of any evidence. There never was any evidence, but it was because she did not behave the way they expected an innocent person to behave. So I'm going to quote here, using a book. You might go to prison even though you're innocent. This is by Justin Brooks. It's an excellent book. He quotes from, there's some quotes there from Amanda Knox's autobiography, Waiting to be Heard. And there's a really, so she says here, I never sobbed openly. I never cried publicly. I bottled up my feelings. It was an uncomfortable trait in a country where emotion is not just commonplace, but expected. And have a little listen to this. This is a quote, again, from her autobiography, Waiting to be Heard, about, Greg Hartley mentions how the Italian interrogators also go for a confession. They use similar methods of interrogation as the US police does, which is once again based upon the Reid technique. And the Reid technique, again, is about gaslighting, manipulating, lying, mentally exhausting, and this idea that police officers have some sort of super ability to detect deception based upon behavioral cues, right? So listen to this. Sitting in that earless interrogation room in Questura, I probably butchered that one too, surrounded by people shouting at me during 43 hours of questioning over 5 days, I got to the point in the middle of the night where I was no longer sure what truth was. I started believing the story the police were telling me. They took me into a state where I was so fatigued and stressed that I started to wonder if I had witnessed Meredith's murder and just didn't remember it. I began questioning my own memory. Greg Hartley says nothing about this. He says nothing about the danger of confrontation-based, confession-based interrogation techniques in evoking false confessions. Nothing at all. And I'm quoting here, Richard Offshea, who's a social psychologist, and Richard Leo explained in their article the decision to confess falsely, rational choice, and irrational action. An innocent suspect is likely to experience considerable shock and disorientation during the interrogation because he is wholly unprepared for the confrontation and accusations that are at the core of the process and will not understand how the investigator could possibly suspect him. An innocent individual may become progressively more distressed, confused, and desperate as he is told of evidence that incriminates him. Remember, in the United States, for example, with the Reid technique, the police are permitted to lie. It's part of the instruction manual. We have evidence. We have this. We have witnesses. And there's So in a study of the first 325 DNA exonerations in the United States, 1989 to 2014, innocent defendants falsely confessed in 27% of those cases. And Greg Hartley is clear that his Italian colleagues are trained in similar methods. Greg Hartley, why don't you mention this when you talk about the Amanda Knox case? These are the red flags we should all be aware of. Now, there is some light in the tunnel here. In the early 90s, in the United Kingdom, due to these sorts of confession techniques, resulting in so many false confessions. And again, I highly recommend the book Duped by Saul Kassin on false confessions and why we believe them. There's also a guy called Gisli Gudjonnson who's written a book called The Psychology of False Confessions, which is also really good. I really recommend that you look into those and then rewatch this two-part series of the four gentlemen in the behavioral panel, who talk about red flags and stuff like that, and see if that doesn't influence how you perceive things. So in the UK and Wales, police officers and psychologists started to collaborate to create what they called the peace method, which was not based upon lying or manipulating or bullshitting or gaslighting or mentally exhausting people, but it was based upon actually getting good rapport and open, honest conversation and eliciting as much information as possible, letting the person being interviewed or interrogated actually talk freely, and then kind of checking the information, checking that information to see how it fit the actual evidence. And this peace method, or aspects of it, is being used in my native Norway. It was adopted here after a very famous case here in Norway called the Birgitte Tengs case, where her cousin was convicted of murder after a false confession. Gisli Gudjonnson, the Icelandic, London-based expert on false confessions, actually confessed, or didn't confess. He actually was a witness at trial. It's being used in New Zealand, Australia, and parts of Canada. And there's a 2014 meta-study that shows that this peace method is more effective both at producing true confessions and protecting against false confessions. So again, Greg Hartley, why don't you mention this stuff when you talk about the Amanda Knox case? So, I mean, once again, Chase Hughes, Greg Hartley, Mark Bowden, Scott Rouse, they have the right to their opinions. Um, but when they sell those opinions as having a base in solid science, they are the ones with guilty knowledge. They are the ones, just like Dr. Phil on his show with the polygraph, actually duping the viewers into thinking that there is a lot of science behind their claims. And the reality is, it isn't. So, I hope. In the end, a couple of book recommendations that I mentioned that I brought here today. Um, Blind Injustice by Mark Godsey, an excellent book. It's also an excellent psychology book. It's the story about a former hard-ass prosecutor who became an innocence lawyer. Excellent stuff about biases, memory, interrogation techniques, confirmation bias, how innocent people actually get convicted. This one's really good. You might go to prison even though you're innocent by Justin Brooks. Talks a little bit about the Amanda Knox case. Writes a little bit about the Reid technique. Again, Duped by Saul Kassin. Writes quite a bit about the Reid technique. I also recommend that you read Timothy Levine's excellent book called Duped. He has a unified theory of deception. He really goes through the deception research. And of course, read the Reid manual, right? Read up on Ekman's work. I've read all of his books. I highly recommend it. But also read Lisa Feldman's book, How Emotions Are Made, because that really shows the lack of science behind Ekman's claims and how a lot of what the behavior panel, this idea that there are emotion circuits in the brain, science doesn't support that. Universal facial expressions for certain emotions, science doesn't support that either. That there is a distinct physiology in the body for various emotions, the science doesn't really support that either. Um, so I hope this video has challenged some of your notions, and and has been useful. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this video, whether you agree or disagree, or what you get from it. And of course, as always, if you're curious to work with me as a client, if you're interested in mentoring, you can contact me through provocative hypnosis.com. As always, thanks for listening.